it's ultimately a question of, do you want to become a vassal state to China, where China will say, you know what, we don't like what you're doing in the Middle East. We don't like what you're doing in Europe. We don't like even, you're trying to push us out of the Panama Canal and force us to sell our port facilities there. You know what, we're going to cut off chips from being sold to your country. Like, that is the problem that you face when your strategic competitor, who ultimately wants, I believe, to become the world's dominant superpower, that they think they have a historical right to, right? Because throughout much of human history, they were the most powerful country on the planet, the most populous. And it's only since the advent of the Industrial Revolution and then the Opium Wars and the Century of Humiliation, as they call it, when the West, and particularly the United Kingdom, eclipsed them, and then later on the United States. So they feel like they're just reemerging to their rightful place, and they want to push everyone around.
Welcome to The Oracle by Polymarket. My name is Will Ward. The Oracle is Polymarket's news and analysis arm, and it's our job to help you understand what's going on in the world through the lens of prediction markets. In this podcast series, we bring on some of the top forecasters, people who really understand what's moving our markets, to walk you through their thought process and how they're developing their own predictions. Today, I'm also joined by my colleague Madi, who's jumping in to co-host from the New York office today. And today, in this episode, we're really excited to be chatting with someone I've wanted to speak with a long time, Dmitri Alperovitch. Dmitri is the founder of Crowdstrike, which is a $90 billion cybersecurity company, and also the author of World on the Brink, which is a new book warning of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. But first, since this is a show all about predictions, we've got to start by highlighting Dmitri's legendary call about 2 years ago, where he put out as a thread on X a prediction of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And this prediction came out about 2 months before the actual invasion, when things were still very much up in the air. So we're going to get to geopolitics, Russia, Ukraine, all that good stuff. But got to start with this, since you're a person that knows a thing or two about cybersecurity. This Trump administration signal story, I've heard people on my feed who are convinced that this is some kind of elaborate psyop, Trump administration trying to inject some kind of narrative into the media. Do you put any probability at all on that being true?
No, I don't. I think this was a screw up. Look, Signal is actually used widely, for better or for worse, within the government. Lots of government officials across all administrations have used it for quite some time. I don't know if they've shared war plans allegedly on Signal before. That might be new, but it's a very prevalent form of communication. And look, the current theory is that they were trying to add Jamieson Greer, who is the head of USTR, in charge of all trade, and would have a need to know, obviously, related to the economic impact of these military strikes. And they added the wrong JG. Jeff Goldberg, the editor of The Atlantic. So, I mean, who hasn't had that happen to them?
Yeah. So, but you run a cybersecurity company. So what does this tell you? What if you're in the point of view of a North Korean hacker or some kind of state level actor? Now that you're aware that these high level Trump administration people are conducting business on Signal, what does that change about what you're doing? What does that tell you?
Yeah, I posted this on X yesterday that the market price for exploits for Signal probably have just risen dramatically. It was always valuable, right? Lots of people use Signal, dissidents use Signal, journalists use Signal. So being able to compromise a device running Signal or the app itself was always quite valuable. But now that you know that you might have potential access to war plans and heads up on U.S. government policy, the most powerful country on the planet, the most powerful people in that country using it for that type of operational coordination, well, that's even more interesting now.
Mm-hmm. What about just in the hierarchy? Okay, so on one level you have a guy who goes on the dark web and buys some exploit or something, and at the other end you have North Korea or something in terms of hacking sophistication. Where do you have to be on that hierarchy to get into something like Signal?
Well, it's a little bit more of a complicated question. To actually develop an exploit for, let's say, the Signal iOS app that runs on your iPhone is a pretty high degree of sophistication, particularly if it's a remote execution exploit. So you're not already on the device trying to get into Signal, but you're trying to compromise it purely through, observing traffic or being able to inject yourself into that traffic. That's pretty complex, pretty high-end skill set. But there is some very sophisticated people that are building those types of exploits that are selling them, right? So if you know who to ask, you might be able to buy an off-the-shelf capability, and that dramatically lowers the bar. So, a great example of this was the NSO company out of Israel, right? That developed some incredibly sophisticated exploits for zero-click exploitation of iPhones, which means that basically I send you a text. If I know your phone number, you don't even see the text. It gets intercepted sort of at that operating system or even baseband layer, compromises the device. You have no idea that anything happened on the device. You don't see the text. You didn't have to click on anything, but the device is compromised and they have access to your geolocation, your camera, your microphone, data on the device, etc. To develop something like that costs millions of dollars. But once you develop it, as NSO did and others are doing, you can sell it still for a relatively high price because it's a high-end tool, but to all sorts of people. So they sold it to Mexican law enforcement, various governments in the Middle East, and others that would not have had the capability to do it themselves, but now can purchase this as a subscription service, right, as a SaaS service from NSO or others that are doing this.
So we're talking like $1 million, 100K, 50K. Like, do you have any sense of that?
I mean, this capability you would shell out at least $1 million, if not more. And this is an ongoing subscription. It's not a one-off thing.
Are you aware of anything like that for Signal?
Not specifically for Signal, but typically, when you buy a capability, it's not that specific. It's there's a feature set that they list, but it'll come probably along with ability to tap WhatsApp, ability to tap Signal, ability to tap iMessage. So you will get that as part of the package that you're paying, at least $1 million probably a year, if not more, as a subscription to.
Oh, so it's more likely you're getting like at the operating system level rather than the app level is what you're saying.
Well, it's likely both, because even if you compromise the iPhone, for example, through like a zero-click vulnerability like I've just described, you still need to do more work to get into Signal. In iOS, they have protection between processes, so one process can't look at the memory and the data of another process. So you have to do privilege escalation. You have to get into the app. You have to figure out how to read the data from that app. So there's more work to be done there. But it's part of that feature set. They're not going to just stop and say, hey, we're now on the device, but we're not actually giving you the ability to tap the microphone or the camera or look at the signal. That's not very valuable, right? So you have to do that extra mile.
Hey, it's Will. Before we continue with the show, I have a super quick ask. This is our 5th podcast episode that we've put out at the Oracle, and we've done these as sort of a pilot, a test to see what we can do with the podcast format, trying to make a show that has some alpha for people who are active forecasters, but is also valuable for people who might never trade on a prediction market at all. You may have noticed in this episode, we're stepping things up a bit. We're going full face docs, brought in a professional editor, and we've also got someone behind the scenes who's trying to book us some really cool high-level guests for the show. But it's still an open question whether the podcast makes sense in the overall mix of content that we're putting out. So here's the ask. Can you stop what you're doing, take just a second, and subscribe to this feed wherever you get your podcasts? We're on Substack, Spotify, YouTube, Apple, everywhere podcasts are distributed. And then when you're done, leave us a quick rating or thumbs up or review to help get the algos cranked up and recommend us to new people. If not, we can always go back to the normal marketing fare that you know and love from Polymarket. But hopefully with your support, we can make this a place where you find some interesting perspectives you may have missed about the markets. If you have feedback, show ideas, guest suggestions, anything like that, you can always find me on X. My handle is @wasabiboat, or by email will@polymarket.com. With that, let's get back to the show.
I have a question about the actual messages that were released yesterday. We've already seen the new administration basically deal with antipathy with their allies, right? What do you take about like this new direction of dealing in friendly terms with our adversaries and dealing in rough terms with our allies? What is a signal about the future of kind of our relations with our allies, first off, and then sort of the realignment happening between the U.S. And Russia and China?
Well, look, Donald Trump is transactional, right? He came out of business. He wasn't in politics to begin with, and he views everything as a deal to be had, right? And as he looks at things of where do I have the maximum amount of leverage? I have the maximum amount of leverage over people that I've been subsidizing, Europe, for example, over decades. and I have the least leverage over someone like Russia, that is an adversarial country that I've already sanctioned to the hill, and I don't have a lot more leverage. So if I want to make a deal with Russia, I probably have to concede a lot more to them than I do to the Europeans that are more dependent on me, right? I think that's part of their thinking, is that we want to do deals, and it's a lot easier to do deals from a position of strength with the people that don't have much leverage over us. At least they're seeing it that way. So the old model that we've had for decades, right, with prior presidents, is that this is sort of a values-based relationship with Europeans, where democratic countries interested in various freedoms and promotion of those freedoms. I think they put much less stock into that and are purely looking at what is the value we can extract from this relationship today? What have you done for me lately? Which is a very kind of business transactional view of the world. Again, I'm not, criticizing or approving it. It's just the way they're thinking about it, which is definitely different from what we've had since roughly 1945.
Do you think it's easy to go back to the old value-based system once Trump is gone? Or is this going to cause a permanent change in American foreign policy?
Well, first of all, it depends on what it means Trump is gone. Trump may be gone, but is the MAGA ideology going to be gone? It may not be, right? So, if J.D. Vance is elected as a successor, you probably will have a continuation of that policy. But look, the reality is, I think you can disagree or agree with Donald Trump, but a lot of what he says, there is fundamental truth in it, right? It is an absolute truth that the Europeans have been free riding and have not been investing in their defense. Who's been saying that? Barack Obama and Joe Biden, right? Long before Donald Trump, right? Even under Bush, this was an issue that was being brought up into the latest stages of Bush. With regards to trade, right, he's not wrong that China in particular has been taking complete advantage of us. And some of the tariffs, the United States has the lowest tariffs in the world of any major developed economy, even compared to some of our partners like in Europe, right? So there is a truth that he's trying to address. You can disagree of whether the way he's going about it is right or wrong, and antagonizing and so forth. But, even immigration, right? No one's disagreeing that the border has been a disaster and that illegal immigration has been out of control. Again, should we be deporting people to El Salvador prisons or not without due process? You could argue about whether that's good or bad, but the issue is there, and, he's trying to address it in the way that he thinks is best.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of the NBA, and every time there's a disgruntled star in the NBA, the team that tries to trade their star gets less value, right? Because everyone knows we got to get rid of this guy. And it feels a bit like, Trump wants to get out of Ukraine. Everyone in the world knows it. And now Putin's kind of like, okay, the balls, I have the power to do what I want to do and to extract what I want to extract out of this situation. Do you view that as valid, or is there kind of like an alternative view on the legibility of the Trump policy abroad?
So look, I spent a lot of time on this issue of Ukraine. I've gone there. I talk regularly to folks in Ukrainian government about this, and I've been telling them for well over a year that regardless of how the election was going to play out in November of 2024, the age of unlimited check writing in terms of military aid to Ukraine was over, right? That was obvious last year when Congress could barely pass a $60 billion package to Ukraine. I told them then, use it wisely because it's the last package. If Kamala Harris had gotten elected, she wouldn't have been able to get anything through Congress, right? If Donald Trump today changes his policy in Ukraine and says, I actually want to supply them with more military aid beyond what has been approved in that package, which is probably about $3 or $4 billion left in that package, he wouldn't be able to get it through Congress because there's just, the Republican Party is opposed to it. And frankly, like I was even hearing last year from Democrats who voted for the package, but were basically saying, how long are we going to keep writing these checks?
The appetite
right?
is gone.
And what
right?
what is the goal here? And we have plenty of things we want to spend this on domestically, right? So, I think there is too much of a focus on what Donald Trump wants or doesn't want, and too little of the appreciation of the reality of where this is headed. And what I've been telling to Ukraine is like, you got to start thinking a year ago, long before Donald Trump, was elected, about how you're going to handle the cutoff of American, at least military aid. I didn't necessarily predict that we would consider cutting off intelligence support and some of these other things that Donald Trump temporarily did. But at least on military aid, it was obvious to me that this was coming to an end. And then the second part of this is, what is your strategy for victory? I've been pretty aggressive with them since about late 2022, early 2023, of what is your concept of victory? Okay, great. You've won the Battle of Kiev. You prevented the overrun of your country. You've recaptured massive amount of territory in the Kharkiv region during that counteroffensive in the fall of 2022. You've retaken Kherson, one of your largest cities. Now what, right? And they put all their eggs in that counteroffensive basket, which, by the way, I believe they should have a right to do. They've earned that right through their blood and sacrifices. But I was very skeptical of it succeeding, in part because, I was closely watching the Russian buildup in the south, the fortifications and the minefields that they had built, but also the lack of training and capability development on the Ukrainian forces, and was very skeptical that this would work. Kharkiv was, I hate to say it this way, the words might be wrong, but kind of an accidental victory. The Russians were caught unawares. The Ukrainians succeeded well beyond their wildest expectations when they were able to drive almost without opposition and recapture most of that territory. Kherson was a much tougher fight. They fought it for months. And ultimately, the reason why they were able to capture Kherson, the city, which, if you recall, is on the right side of the Dnieper River, cut off from most of the Russian occupied territories, on the other side of the river, the logistics were unsustainable for them. It was only a matter of time before they would withdraw. But even with those contested logistics, with the bridges over the river being basically decimated by Ukrainian strikes, it took them months to withdraw before the Ukrainians were able to really push them out. And they withdrew in orderly fashion without losing that contingent of forces. There were fears in Russia that they would get surrounded and a huge number of their forces would get captured. That did not happen. Right. So I was looking at all that and saying, the chances of this counteroffensive are pretty low, but they've earned the right to try. Let's see what happens. But I was also asking them, what is your concept of victory? Let's assume this counteroffensive in the summer of 23, would have been a huge success. And they would have accomplished the objective, which was to get to the Sea of Azov, right? And potentially get long-range strike capabilities in range of Crimea. Then what? And let's assume I even would, in a hypothetical, would concede to them that, let's say you even take Crimea. I didn't think they would take it or be able to take it, but let's say you do. And let's say you even capture all the territory back, even going down to 2014 levels, right? Everything that the Russians had taken from you in the last 8 years, you get it all back. Why would the war end? Like, would Putin suddenly say, well, I've lost that territory. Okay, now I'm going home and surrendering? No. The only thing that does is just moves the front line, right? And it doesn't actually end the war. The war ends when Putin decides it's over, either because he's achieved his objectives or because he's realized that they can no longer be achieved and the cost is too high. So I've always had this problem of, how do you strategically win this war by just taking territory? It never made any sense to me. And of course, the counteroffensive didn't succeed. It failed. And then it made even less sense of, well, what are you trying to do now? You don't actually have a strategy for victory. And it became clear to me in the summer of 23 that this is now fundamentally a war of attrition, that neither side has the offensive capacity to accomplish the objectives. Ukraine doesn't have the offensive capacity to take back its territory and end the war. And the Russians don't have the offensive capacity to take over Ukraine in the way they want to. And now you grind each other out, sort of World War I style. And in a war of attrition, the way you win it, ultimately, if you don't have the ability to generate enough force to change the dynamics, which neither side does, is by outlasting the enemy. So what I thought the Ukrainians should do is figure out, if you're truly committed to victory here and you don't want to concede to Russian maximalist demands, which remain maximalist from Putin, we can talk about what those are and why I think the peace in the near term is unlikely. But if you don't want to do that, then the right way to think about this is you're going to fight a very long war. It could take 5 years, it could take 10 years, it could take 20 years, until the Russians are exhausted and they decide to leave, like they left Afghanistan, like we left Vietnam, like, we left Afghanistan. That's how you defeat great powers, is you exhaust them and you advertise to them, not that this thing will be over by Christmas, as Zelensky had done with his counteroffensive, but that it will take as long as it takes. We're going to fight for generations if that's what it's needed, but we're not going to surrender an inch of our territory. We're not going to surrender our sovereignty. We're going to do whatever is necessary to win, which was the mindset of the North Vietnamese, the mindset of the Mujahideen, the mindset of the Taliban. That's how they beat those great powers, right? Including us. So that's your option. It's a horrible option, right? It means further destruction of the country, unimaginable losses, all of that. But the other option is effective surrender. And there were never any other options, right? And all this flirtation, which was incredibly frustrating, with NATO membership, with, you remember in the early days of the war, no-fly zones that the NATO would, supposedly establish over Ukraine, or security guarantees. None of that was ever real. It was all fairy tale, because no one was ever going to come to Ukrainians' defense and fight Russia on their behalf. No one is willing to do that today. No one's willing to do that in the future, right? You're having this insane conversation right now in London and Paris, and to some extent even Germany, of how many troops they're all going to send when the war is over. Well, first of all, like, who knows when the war is going to be over? And two, what are those troops going to be doing? Are you going to send those troops, and are you going to get the support of your population to send those troops to fight Russia in case it reinvades? Who's up for that? Or are they just going to be there hanging out in the bars, and the minute that Russia starts mobilizing again, they're going to flee the country, as all of them did at 22? My bet is on the latter, because if you want to fight Russia, if you want to defend Ukrainian sovereignty and the concept of territorial integrity and all of that, the right time to do is now. I'm sure Ukrainians would welcome you. Go right ahead.
Yeah.
Go to the Donbass and fight Russia. No one wants to do that. No one's going to be willing to do that in the future. So the only ones that have to fight Russians, if they want to, are the Ukrainians. And this is going to be incredible sacrifices if they're willing to do it. They don't actually need America for this, right? This is kind of coming back around to Trump, is that to do a defensive battle, an attritional battle where you're not focused on retaking territory, you're focused on holding the line, using drone strikes, which they mostly manufacture themselves, so they just need cash for that, which the Europeans can supply, using artillery for suppression fires and mortars, which the Europeans increasingly can provide. They've ramped up their production significantly, particularly Rheinmetall in Germany, using small arms and grenade launchers and minefields, mines Ukrainians are able to manufacture. So most of that, the Europeans, if they decide to really commit to this, can provide to Ukraine without American support. There are a few gaps. The biggest one is probably in the air defense space, with Patriot systems defending against Russian ballistic missile. There is an equivalent system that the French supposedly have called Aster. They've deployed it to Ukraine recently. It hasn't performed very well. Maybe it can be improved. Or worst case scenario, the Europeans maybe could go to Trump and say, look, I know you want to be done with Ukraine. We are stepping in, doing exactly what you wanted. We are going to commit to providing military aid to them without a penny of American taxpayer dollars going to this country anymore. But what we need you to do is sell us your Patriot interceptors. We'll pay for them, market price. You'll make money on this. Everyone is happy. And I think you'd say yes to that. So there is a way to do this, but commit to a long war to ultimately defeat the Russians if the Ukrainians and the Europeans are willing to do so. And if they're sort of finally appreciate that Donald Trump is done, like, he has no interest in Ukraine, he has no interest in this war, he has no interest in asking Congress to pay for it. And it feels a little bit like, your girlfriend has just broken up with you and is dating a new guy, a shirtless guy maybe, and you keep begging her to take you back. She's already moved on. That's done. Go out and meet a new girl. Germany, France, UK, Poland, etc., and make that relationship work. That's what you should be focused on.
So we're getting to sort of like the end game, the next step, and we've got a lot. We need to hit China and a bunch of other stuff. But I want to go back to the start of the war, and your legendary call 2 months before it started about, you basically called the shot that Putin was going to invade. So you put out an extremely detailed thread talking about your logic and what you were seeing. But I want to know, like, in the spirit of Polymarket, where you're putting kind of like a numerical probability on these things, what confidence level were you at that time? And like, what did you see that got you from the, okay, I'm not going to post this to I'm going to post this? Well, was there one thing, or was it a group of things?
I was at like 80% back in kind of mid-December when I made that call. Towards end of January, February, I was at like 95. The weekend before the war, I was at 99. I was actually at Munich Security Conference. Zelensky, if you recall, flew in there from Kiev. I was actually convinced the war would start that weekend because I'm like, this is a perfect opportunity. The leader's out of the country. You start the war, prevent him from going back easily. Do a decapitation strike on the rest of that infrastructure. He waited for whatever reason, Putin did, and began it 4 days later. But I remember I was having all these incredulous conversations with German officials and others at the Munich Security Conference. It's a confab of diplomats, foreign ministers, defense ministers, and all the Europeans were completely convinced that this was a bluff. This wasn't going to happen. I'm like, you guys are delusional. Like, this is absolutely happening. This is happening probably this weekend, if not in the next few days. And they were just totally missing it.
Yeah. So in terms of what's going to happen next, we can just do a few kind of like rapid fire markets on Ukraine. So the biggest Ukraine market that we have is ceasefire. There's the April 20th ceasefire odds. That's at 17%. If you go out to the end of the year, it goes up higher to, I think it's at 68% right now. So it sounds like, from what you said before, you'd probably be an under on the 68 even, that it's gonna drag out.
No. Well, so a couple of things. So they actually just, as we're recording this on Tuesday, the U.S. and the Ukrainians have just met in Riyadh. By the way, it's interesting that all these conversations are happening in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is not the shortest place between Ukraine and the United States, but it's interesting that they're injecting themselves into it. But they've agreed to a partial ceasefire in the maritime domain to basically halt strikes on the Russian Black Sea Fleet if they reciprocate against Ukrainian civilian shipping and stay out of Western Black Sea. And they've agreed to immediately halt deeper strikes on energy targets, which Putin has allegedly agreed to as well, even though he hasn't yet. We haven't seen any results on the ground from that. So I think good chance that type of ceasefire could hold for at least a while. And then there's a discussion about a 30-day full-on ceasefire, which I think better than 50% chance you could get to, primarily because, and I posted this on X as well, Putin is now seeing a much bigger prize than just Ukraine, which he's still very much interested in. And he's not backing off of his original objectives for domination of Ukraine. But he's now seeing an opportunity to strategically upend the entire relationship with the United States, something that not only has he wanted for a long time, like every Soviet leader back to Stalin had wanted, right? Back in 1945, in February of 1945, you had this, in the midst of World War II, this summit in Yalta between FDR and Stalin and Churchill. And Stalin was effectively offering a deal of like, let's divide the world into our spheres of influence. I'll have mine, you have yours, and everything will be copacetic, right? FDR really wasn't very interested because I think he was seeing American power, ability to, both economically and militarily, was much more powerful than the Soviet Union. We're still in the midst of providing weapons to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. They were helping them with on the Eastern Front. Economically, obviously, we're one of the few economies in the world that wasn't decimated during World War II. For all those reasons, he was like, not actually interested in the deal. I'm interested in trying to liberate as much of Europe as possible and prevent you from dominating. I mean, Stalin actually wanted full American withdrawal from Europe, right? I mean, not just like Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Like the demands were big. And this was rejected ultimately. But every leader since then, and Brezhnev offered the same to Kissinger and Nixon in the 70s. Let's just run the world together. And Putin now sees an opportunity to actually get something like that done, where he sees that Trump is not interested in Europe, so he could I don't think Trump will give him Europe, but if the United States leaves, let's say NATO, or even withdraws forces from Europe, withdrawing from NATO, that changes dramatically, Russia's strategic position on the continent. He sees opportunities to collaborate with America in the Middle East and the Arctic and elsewhere. So that's a huge prize that has now been put on the table for him, that he doesn't want to jeopardize by just angering Trump, rejecting things out of hand. And a 30-day ceasefire is a small price to pay. It won't dramatically change things on the ground for him. He could always break it and blame it on the Ukrainians, orchestrate some sort of, they violated some provision of the ceasefire and now it's gone. Now, even with those terms, he's setting conditions for it. The answer to the 30-day proposal was not no from him, but yes, but. And he's saying, well, what about military aid to Ukraine? And by the way, the argument he's probably going to make to Trump is, why would you provide military aid to Ukraine when there's a ceasefire and we're working towards peace? Like, that makes no sense. Why would you spend the U.S. taxpayer dollars on that? Just cut that off and push the Europeans to cut that off to the extent you can. What about mobilization of personnel in Ukraine? Like, we don't want their army to get bigger and be better trained during the 30 days. So he's pushing for that. Ultimately, if they hold the line, I think Putin would actually concede on most of these points because, again, 30 days is not a big price to pay. So that's why I'm probably at like 65% that you could get a ceasefire done in the next few months, a 30-day ceasefire. The fact that it would lead to some sort of peace deal, I think, is very, very low. I mean, the situation actually is remarkably similar to the situation in the Middle East with Gaza and Hamas. Yeah, you got a ceasefire. It didn't last. Everyone knew it wouldn't last because neither side, Hamas or Israel, was interested in ending the war yet. Or at least on the conditions that were agreed to in the ceasefire. And you will have the same situation, I think, play out in Russia.
So it sounds like, I was going to ask you, what is a testable condition that we could see this kind of like wider negotiation with Trump and Putin? And we have this market, will any country leave NATO in 25? That's a 16%. You think really like NATO is on the table? Should that be higher?
No, I don't think that. Look, for the U.S. to leave NATO, Trump has to see some benefit from it. And right now, I think there's nothing but downsides. And it's much better to use it as a leverage point, the threat of leaving NATO, to push the Europeans to do more than actually leaving it. So I think there's enough people in the administration, Waltz, Rubio, and others that will say this doesn't really make sense for us to leave it. So he didn't leave it the first term. Maybe he'll leave it sometime in the second term, but I'm not sure it's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah. I want this, I want to kind of talk about China right now. So, Taiwan seems to be a considerably more strategic asset to the United States than Ukraine ever was. And we're dealing with a much more powerful entity in the Chinese, right? Economically, militarily, and their sphere of influence is much larger than Russia. So if we weren't able to do anything to stop the Ukrainian invasion, what gives you any hope that we could do that for Taiwan?
Well, first of all, it's what you just said, that it matters a lot more to us. Ukraine never did, right? President Biden at the time, back even in December of 2021, when people started talking about potential invasion, ruled out preemptively the idea that any American forces would ever be sent to defend Ukraine. He had actually done the opposite during his tenure on Taiwan. On 5 occasions, when reporters had asked him if he would defend Taiwan or some variant of that question, he had said yes 5 times. Right? Now, every time he would do this, the staff would walk it back, but 5 times, that's a lot of times to confirm this, right? So that, I think, is an indication of how much Taiwan matters, right? And we've had, of course, a deep history of engagement in Taiwan, certainly since 1949, when Chiang Kai-shek lost the civil war on the mainland and fled to Taiwan. We actually protected them against Mao's attempts to invade. In the 50s, we had a military defense treaty and an obligation to defend them until 1979. We had military troops on Taiwan, right? So we've had none of that with Ukraine, right? So that history is not there. There's been appreciation from strategic thinkers in this country for many decades of the importance of Taiwan before a single chip was even manufactured anywhere in the world. Namely, General Douglas MacArthur in 1950 said this is an unsinkable aircraft carrier, right? Taiwan. And we even considered in 1944 invading Taiwan when at the time it was occupied by the Japanese. There was a plan that was put together 2 months after D-Day called Operation Causeway for the invasion of Formosa, as Taiwan was called at the time, right? This is how serious we were about this island. And then, of course, now the situation is even more amplified because of two things. A, semiconductors and the importance of semiconductors to the global economy. No digital good can be made without semiconductors. There's a saying that chips are the new oil. I hate that phrase because oil has alternatives. There's no replacement for chips, right? So they're actually way more important than oil. And then the second piece, and Taiwan, of course, produces not just 90% of all advanced chips, as people often say, but actually 40% of all chips, period. Right. So just a huge market share, by far the largest of any other country, which is not going away anytime soon, despite all the noise about the CHIPS Act, which is important about preserving really the semiconductor manufacturing base in this country and growing it a little bit. But it was not going to challenge Taiwan anytime soon. TSMC has built one fab in Arizona, and it just announced 3 more fabs with this $100 billion investment. TSMC is building one fab a year in Taiwan for the next decade, right? So, and by the way, the footprint already that exists there is just the largest in the world. So there's just no way in which in the next decade Taiwan is not an enormous player in the space. And losing Taiwan would be economically devastating if those fabs are destroyed in the course of war, or if China just takes them, if Taiwan surrenders and now has enormous leverage over the entire world and the United States in particular. And then the second element of this is the rise of China and the strategic competitor that China has become. I believe we're in a new Cold War, as I argue in my book, with China that is very similar on almost every level to the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And Taiwan is actually the cork that keeps China bottled up. The geography is really important. And in the book, I have this map that looks at the depth of the waters in all around Chinese shores. And you see that the dilemma that China has is that the depth of the waters is very shallow all around the coast, from East China Sea to South China Sea. In the Taiwan Strait, for example, it's only 300 feet, too shallow to even put a submarine in without it being easily detected. But on the other side of Taiwan, and that whole first island chain, as it's called, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, the depth of the waters is much, much deeper, 12,000 feet right off the coast of eastern coast of Taiwan, and goes down even further from there. So allowing China to control Taiwan allows it to escape from this containment that it sees itself in, this arc of containment of U.S. military bases and allies from South Korea to Japan to Philippines and Taiwan, and now actually turn the tables on America and push the American forces out of the region, because now they would be endangering our lines of communication to Japan, Philippines, and Korea, and potentially push us all the way back to Hawaii. So very, very strategic for China, and obviously would allow China to rise enormously in terms of its power and prestige, first and foremost in the region itself, in Asia, where you have almost 40% of the world's GDP, most of the economic growth, most of the supply chains, and so forth. You add on top of that the chips issue, and you can see how Taiwan is very, very different from Ukraine in terms of importance to the United States.
I read your book and I read that argument, and I couldn't help thinking, okay, imagine a world where China owns Taiwan. They're selling us chips in the same way that they sell us all the other stuff. They have their Navy there that can get out and go in the Pacific more. What's the problem from an American point of view? Like, how would that affect the average American citizen if China can send their ships out more?
That's a great question. And it assumes that everything is hunky-dory today, which it's not. So, for example, we have an enormous dependency on China in one particular strategic area today, which is critical minerals. Processed rare earths, as well as other critical minerals, where China dominates processing and refining across a whole slew of minerals. Not every single one, but many of them. And they're using that as a weapon against us today. They're cutting off supplies of gallium and germanium in opposition to what we are doing in East Asia, both tariffs as well as supplies of weapons to Taiwan and so forth. And the greater their power becomes, the more they're going to be willing to use that weapon against us and push us around, not just in the region, but everywhere around the world. So it's ultimately a question of, do you want to become a vassal state to China, where China will say, you know what, we don't like what you're doing in the Middle East. We don't like what you're doing in Europe. We don't like even, you're trying to push us out of the Panama Canal and force us to sell our port facilities there. You know what, we're going to cut off chips from being sold to your country. Like, that is the problem that you face when your strategic competitor, who ultimately wants, I believe, to become the world's dominant superpower, that they think they have a historical right to, right? Because throughout much of human history, they were the most powerful country on the planet, the most populous. And it's only since the advent of the Industrial Revolution and then the Opium Wars and the Century of Humiliation, as they call it, when the West, and particularly the United Kingdom, eclipsed them, and then later on the United States. So they feel like they're just reemerging to their rightful place, and they want to push everyone around. And by the way, they're doing this to smaller countries today. They're doing this to Taiwan. They're doing this to Japan. They're doing it to Australia. Remember, Australia had the gall in 2020 to say, maybe we should have an investigation into the origins of COVID. How dare they, right? Maybe it was a lab leak. Like, let's just investigate. They weren't even suggesting that it was, which I think, now you see more and more potential evidence that it was a lab leak. But they were just saying, why don't we investigate? What did China do? It cut off imports of barley and wines and lobster and all sorts of things in an attempt to damage the Australian economy and bully them around. They do this constantly. They've done it to Lithuania. They've done it to so many countries around the world. So do you want this happening to America, where now we're going to be asking, oh my God, what does China think of this? On any issue, not just what happens with Taiwan or in Asia, but anything that we would like to do economically, militarily, you name it. Now China is going to have the sword of Damocles over us. Is that something you're interested in doing?
So, Dmitry, I firmly believe that it's very likely this happens. Like, I'm actually on the same page with you. What I'm interested in is, what are the leading indicators in the near term of an invasion of Taiwan? Like, what's going to happen 1 year, 6 months, 3 months, 1 month, 1 week out from an invasion? And how can we sort of track the progress?
Well, first of all, an invasion of Taiwan will be the world's largest, most complicated military operation in human history. This is how difficult this is, right? And just to give you one comparison, I already talked about this Operation Causeway, the U.S. war plan to invade Taiwan in 1944. It was put together 2 months after D-Day, 2 months after the most successful amphibious invasion in human history, and the largest, right? It included, as you know, 150,000 Allied troops crossing the English Channel, about the width of Taiwan Strait, landing on the beaches of Normandy, liberating France and ultimately Europe. So 2 months after that incredible success, the Joint Staff puts together the war plan for Taiwan. It calls for double the number of troops that we used in D-Day. Double. They estimated a 2-month brutal campaign fighting up the island to ultimately displace only 60,000 Japanese troops that were there on the island, and suffering about 45,000 casualties. Just to give you a sense, on D-Day, we lost about 2,000 men. The deadliest, one of the deadliest days, I think may have been the deadliest single day in American military history. Maybe a Civil War battle. Plank you out in the name.
You got to take me back to the U.S. history.
Gettysburg. Maybe Gettysburg was a little bit higher. Taiwan, incredibly costly. And ultimately, Roosevelt, MacArthur looked at this and said, no, this is too hard, right? For the United States military that has just pulled this off, this was viewed as too costly, too risky. Now you don't have 60,000 Japanese troops on the island. You have 100,000 Taiwanese regular forces on the island. Of course, defensive capabilities, aircraft, air defense, anti-ship missiles, all that has improved dramatically in the last 81 years. But the 100,000 roughly active duty force is actually decent. It could be better, but it's not bad. They also have 1 million or so in reserves, which is horrendous and basically needs to be improved massively, but nevertheless, it's a lot of people, and who knows how many they would mobilize to counter the invasion. So for the Chinese to even consider this, you need to bring probably 1 million men across the strait, with all the logistics, all the supportive capabilities to even attempt this invasion. That's that is just enormous fleet that you need, enormous resources. They've never pulled anything off of the scale. The last time they fought a war was in 1979, right? 46 years ago. They invaded Vietnam. Did not work out very well for them. Was quite embarrassing. So this is very, very difficult for them to do. And the preparation that has to go for this is going to be massive, right? The issue is not, are we going to be surprised and tomorrow they're invading? It's that we're going to see for probably a year plus, lots and lots of preparations, even through just open source intelligence, if not leaks from government officials to the media, about barracks being built in port facilities, stockpiles of equipment and ammunition and blood supplies, and confiscation of civilian vessels for military use, and movements of the fleet from South China Sea to East China Sea. All of this stuff, large-scale exercise, not, a few dozen ships and aircraft that we're seeing with Taiwan, but something that's 10x that, right? In terms of full-on scale for a realistic exercise for invasion. So that's what you're going to see. You haven't seen any of that on any such scale. So I think we're still years away from them being able to pull it off. And of course, we know that Xi Jinping has given the order to the PLA to be ready to invade by 2027. Doesn't mean that he's going to invade in 27. In fact, I think 27 is actually a very unlikely date for invasion, a year for invasion. I can explain why. But the most important thing is he's giving them the deadline, which means that he knows today they're not ready, right? You don't give a deadline to be ready if you think you're ready today. So they're not ready today. And you're going to see this massive mobilization. And then the political environment has to be shaped as well. I think for several years in advance, you're going to see statements from the Chinese basically saying that we are giving up on peaceful unification with Taiwan, that we don't think it's ever going to work, and sort of preparing both their population and the world for the reality that we're committed to unification. This is the ultimate goal for Chinese national rejuvenation, as Xi Jinping calls it, that has to be accomplished by 2049. Taiwan is a corner piece of that. And we've given up on this being done peacefully. And the more you start seeing those types of statements from them, the more it means that they're finally realizing that the only path to doing this is through coercion, through military force of some sort.
What about, I've heard the scenario that they don't really need to invade. All they need to do is just cut off the shipping going in and out of Taiwan, and they could do that with a much smaller force. Do you think that's realistic?
No, not at all. I wrote a piece in the War on the Rocks on this last summer, looking at the blockade scenario. First of all, the Chinese are actually not focused on blockade. Like, you read the open source PLA literature, People's Liberation Army literature, no one talks about blockade. They talk about invasion scenarios. So the only ones that seem to be obsessed with a blockade are think tankers in Washington and some Taiwanese, but not the actual Chinese. And of course, they know that it doesn't work. First of all, the idea of a blockade is based on this concept that Taiwan imports a lot of its food and a lot of its energy from the rest of the world, right? So cutting that off is going to severely endanger the island. And that is true, but it's not the full story. So when you look at the food, and I look deeply at this issue, sure, they import a lot of food. They import tuna, they import Wagyu beef, they import caviar, they import lots of things. Doesn't mean that it's necessary for survival. And they actually have a very robust agricultural industry. They have big rice fields, they grow vegetables, they have fish in their lakes and rivers and nearby oceans. And if push comes to shove, it won't be like a luxurious survival, but no one is going to starve to death. They have plenty of calories to supply to their own population just through their own indigenous agricultural production, right? Even if all food is cut off. Secondly, energy is a huge problem. They import massive amounts of energy, about to import even more as they're shutting down their last nuclear fields. They've been investing in solar, they've been investing in hydro, they've been investing in offshore wind, but that is really small scale. So energy is going to be a problem. But guess what? This is a tropical climate. Now it's going to be freezing to death like they are in Ukraine when the energy grid gets hit, right? You may not have air conditioning in the summer and won't be, wonderful, but and the economy will collapse. But you're not going to be starving. You're not going to be freezing to death. And why would you surrender when you know that what is going to happen to you, and the Chinese are very open about this, is you're going to go into re-education camps. And if you have any questions as a Taiwanese citizen of what that's like, go ask the Uyghurs how much you're going to enjoy that, right? And there's no precedent in modern history of blockades working even against cities, much less countries. First of all, you have the siege of Leningrad in 1940s during World War II, a 2-year plus siege by the Nazis. 1 million people starved and froze to death. Soviet citizens. The city did not surrender. More recent history is the siege of Sarajevo during the Bosnian conflicts, and you had 65,000 casualties during that siege. A 4.5-year siege, did not surrender. You're telling me a country of 25 million people that is not starving to death, that is not freezing to death, is going to surrender when they know what the outcome is going to be like? And by the way, it's not like Taiwan can't do anything about it. They have military capabilities. They can start sinking those Chinese ships. The U.S. Navy may run through that blockade and basically, tell the Chinese try to thwart us, and are you willing to go to war with us? And then China is highly dependent on on Taiwanese chips production as well. So while Taiwan is blockaded, obviously China is not getting any chips from Taiwan, so its economy is going down the toilet, as is the world's economy. Probably 5% of GDP contraction in the first year of a blockade. And in that scenario, the pressure on China, both domestically and internationally, the longer this goes on, is going to be immense. Of like, end this thing. You're putting all of us into global depression, right? So I just don't see any way in which this works. Now, that's not to say that during an invasion, of course, there'll be a blockade of the island. They'll want to prevent resupplies, but that's not the end game. That just phase one of an invasion. That I believe, but as a standalone thing, either it fails and China loses face and Xi Jinping may lose power, if not worse, or it escalates into an invasion, and then you better be ready to invade if you're going to undertake this. So you might as well just start the invasion to begin with.
It seems to me like the Trump foreign policy, the kind of demands of reducing our military global footprint runs at odds with defending Taiwan. And I kind of understand the logic of, okay, we're not ready yet for this type of invasion, but surely there has to be some calculus of like, okay, is Trump going to defend as vigorously as, whoever comes next? Who knows who comes next, right? It could be Dems, it could be who, we really don't know, right? 4 years is a long ways away. Is that not part of the Chinese calculus?
It's a hard one for them to predict because Donald Trump is just so unpredictable, right? One vision of Donald Trump is that he doesn't want wars. He wants peace everywhere. He wants to pull out of everywhere. And yet, what is he doing right now? Bombing the Houthis, right? An area that, if there's anything we've learned from these leaked signal messages.
Dmitry, I want to push back on that because it seems like, Donald Trump has no problem going after much smaller enemies, right? The Houthis who are the Houthis? They have some, Iranian capabilities, whatever, but they're nothing, right, compared to the U.S. And Taiwan's not that, right? And so, yeah, I think like I remember, in the first term, Trump's first term, like a month into office, he dropped a giant bomb in Afghanistan, huge, like our largest non-nuclear bomb. Right. So like he does these kind of things just to kind of.
Well, yes, but he also killed Soleimani, which everyone said was very escalatory and risked huge retaliation from Iran, which they launched ballistic missiles at our bases in Iraq. And it's only a miracle that no one was killed, like truly a miracle. Right. And by the way, there's the military dimension to this. There's also an economic dimension. He might be saying, OK, I'm going to completely decouple from China. Not, 45% tariffs, which roughly they are today, but like all trade gone, right? And decimate you economically, right? So there's a lot of unpredictability for China here. Maybe they can come to some sort of agreement. We'll buy your soybeans. You don't defend Taiwan. Who knows? But my only point is that the unpredictability of this president is unnerving, not just our allies, but also our enemies.
Yeah. In that scenario, China and the U.S. trade gone. Who hurts more?
Well,
or is it just totally Pyrrhic?
If both of us shoot guns at each other and you hit my liver and I hit your, other vital organ, who hurts more? I mean, it's going to be devastating for everyone. U.S. is probably more isolated from this, but no one wins in that scenario.
All right, let's go a little bit to AI, because I think this is a large part of your book where you talk about sort of like the strategic role of chips and how that feeds into AI. And I guess like the one kind of update since your book was published was this DeepSeek AI model that came out. And there's a question of like, do they really need the chips? Did they just kind of steal the American models through the API and kind of like back engineer it that way? Or in any case, they were able to develop sort of a peer level cutting edge AI model without the need for massive amounts of chips. And in the book, you talk about, you know, the Biden policy to restrict the chips going into China. Did that sort of backfire and create the need to have these like crafty workarounds, or how do you update your thesis on the role of chips after DeepSeek?
No, if anything, I'm even more bullish on the fact that they're absolutely vital. In fact, this is, I think, one of the most misunderstood things in general press about DeepSeek. DeepSeek could not have happened without a huge number of NVIDIA GPUs, right? In fact, in their own paper, they talk about H800s that they use to train DeepSeek, and most people believe that they also had H100 GPUs from NVIDIA that they smuggled in there, right? And H800s are basically a slightly diminished H100 chip that was produced by NVIDIA shortly after the first round of export controls were introduced by the Biden administration to fly just under the threshold that the Biden administration established. And for about a year, they were able to ship those chips to China. And then the Biden administration came in and said, oops, that's not what we wanted. We're actually going to cut those off as well. So now H800s are banned, but they were able to buy a lot of them during that period. So if anything, the lesson we've learned is we need to go much further on chip export controls, and we need to do it all versus, this, piecemeal approach that is going to create smuggling conditions and evolution in the AI industry in China. So chips are still very important. Did they incentivize China to become more independent? No. I mean, this has been a longstanding goal of both China more generally and Xi Jinping more specifically. The whole Made in China 2025 plan, which they didn't reach in most industries, was to achieve independence in semiconductor production and advanced technologies. So they didn't need any incentives. This was a longstanding goal because, by the way, if you're thinking about invading Taiwan, as they've been thinking about since Mao days, right, since 1949, and you know that there's a potential for you to confront the United States, the last thing you want to do is be dependent on the United States for anything, particularly something as important as AI. So, I don't buy that argument at all that this has, created some incentives. The incentives were already there. If anything, we've learned that you need to address the smuggling. Compute remains the only key factor in thwarting someone's success in AI. There's a reason why there are only really two countries that are producing frontier quality AI models, the United States and China. What do they have in common? Not talent. Talent is everywhere. There's Europeans that are talented, Latin Americans that have plenty of AI talent around the world. It's not algorithms. The algorithms are fairly well known, and a lot of open source literature on the algorithms. It's compute with enough financial backing to buy that compute, right? And that's why you've not seen Europe really play a role at all in this. You have one company that's trying to produce frontier models, Mistral. It's falling far behind because they don't have the cash to keep up with ChatGPT, with Anthropic, with Google, and so forth. China has the cash, and as long as it can buy chips through the black market or direct, it's going to be doing very well. And as we're recording this, DeepSeek just released an updated model that, without the reasoning capabilities, actually exceeds Claude from Anthropic and ChatGPT. Now, the reasoning capabilities are actually way more important, so it's still not up to snuff with those, but it's getting better, right? And there's still massive amounts of smuggling going on. One of the top buyers of NVIDIA GPUs is Malaysia and Singapore. I can tell you they're not buying it for data centers in those countries. It just passed through on the way to China. So one of the things the Biden administration did in literally the last week, and it's a big question of why did they wait 4 years, but in the last week of the presidency in January, they announced this AI diffusion rule, which the Trump administration has not reversed. It was an executive order. Trump reversed numerous Biden executive orders. This one is still, knock on wood, to this day, in effect. It actually goes into implementation in May, because you have to have a 90-day period between when you announce and when you implement this. And it's actually a pretty groundbreaking rule. It actually establishes a global export control regime on advanced compute, particularly GPUs. And it basically divides the world into 3 regions. There's the countries from which are banned from purchasing any advanced GPUs, period. So China, Russia, Iran, so forth are in that category. There's the countries where it is allowed almost without restrictions. And there's only a few of those. Not even all of Europe is in there. Like Germany, UK, yes, but like a lot of the smaller European countries are not in that category. And then there's the vast majority of the world that is in that gray zone, that second phase, if you will, of this export controls, where they're extremely limited in the number of chips that they can buy. Basically ensuring that, if they're doing black market sales to China, or even trying to build their own massive compute clusters like UAE and Saudi want to do, who are in that second phase category, they can't do it. And they certainly can't compete with the compute that will be available in America to American companies. So that, if that rule goes into effect in May, will have a huge ramifications for, first and foremost, NVIDIA's business, but also for the outcome of this global competition on AI. And what's most important is not how capable DeepSeek is today versus ChatGPT or Claude or whatever. Today's models, I think, will be looked at as the Apple IIs of the 1980s. Really cool thing, but not ultimately where this thing is going, right? And in the next 5 years, we'll be, using the Apple II analogy, at the iPhone stage. So if China stands still and is still at the Apple II when we're on the iPhone, you can imagine who's going to win this race. So that's really the question of where is this headed, and are we going to be able to dramatically slow them down as the cost of compute, the number of these chips that you need to train, continues to grow exponentially, right? The cost of the model today to train is about $100 million, and will be $1 billion probably this year, and could rise further in the next few years. And not many countries can afford to spend that much, not many companies. And even if they can't get the chips, because that's where the majority of the cost is, the capex goes into running and buying those chips. That's going to be a way we win this thing.
Can you make that more concrete? Like, when you connect the AI to the possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan, what is is AI, you think in a few years it's going to be just massively boosting a country's GDP that they have, and then they're going to have more economic power? Or is it they're going to put AI in the drones and that's going to make them super drones and better on the battlefield? Or what is the actual advantage that the AI will accrete to these countries?
Yeah, so I don't actually believe that AI is very relevant in the very near term that we're talking about with regards to the invasion of Taiwan. Eventually, as you get into the 2030s, you will have more and more AI-enabled capabilities, military capabilities that will be important to the future of warfare, but probably not on the time frame we're talking about here in terms of the risk of the invasion in the next potentially 3 years, right? Because the militaries simply don't innovate that fast. Even if the weapon exists, they're not going to procure it in quantities. They're not going to integrate it fast enough, change their doctrine, and everything else. That takes a lot longer than people often realize. But if we keep delaying the invasion, then eventually that becomes more and more relevant. And secondly, if you sort of set Taiwan aside, the nature of this competition with China is not just Taiwan. As I've said before, this is a Cold War II with China. And Taiwan is basically this regional flashpoint that West Berlin was during the first Cold War. But once the Berlin crisis was resolved in 1962, when the Soviets built the Berlin Wall, well, these Germans, on behalf of the Soviets, built the Berlin Wall, the Cold War didn't end, of course, right? Just because the immediate threat of invasion of Western Berlin ended, the Cold War continued. And the Cold War with China, regardless of what happens with Taiwan, I think will almost certainly continue. And that's when you start thinking about the technological advantages, the economic advantages, and the transformations that AI will have in virtually every part of our economy. And you want to make sure that you preserve that. It's sort of like, we invented the supercomputers back in the first Cold War. we didn't decide of like, well, why don't we just give them to the Soviets? Like, there's no direct applicability to supercomputers versus, their capability to invade West Berlin. Why not just give it to them? No one was thinking that. You would have been crazy to even suggest that. And yet somehow today we have this debate about whether we should supply GPUs to China. It's just insanity.
With regards to the technological race in general, the Chinese seem to have fewer rules. They seem to be committed to winning the technological race on all fronts, right?
Which we should be as well.
Which we should be as well. But I go back to the bio and CRISPR, right? Because there's less like it's actually an area where it's less about putting in a ton of money and just putting in a bunch of talent. And I'm sure the AI is going to get more tightly integrated into the biotech sphere. But like for now, you can compete with far fewer dollars, right? And
yeah, I think AI is about to change all of that. I mean, you're already starting to see AI develop new drug candidates, new treatments.
Right.
I think in 10 years, the entire biotech space will be dominated by AI. I'm quite confident of that. And if you're leading in AI, it will give you a natural advantage. Doesn't mean that it's guaranteed, but it gives you a huge advantage. So I think that, look, I'm very bullish in the long term on AI. I can't think of almost any area of the not just technology space, but really human occupations that will not be dramatically disrupted for good and bad by AI.
Yeah. Well, so the point I was making is that, going back to the CRISPR and sort of the advancements that China's made on CRISPR, I mean, China already has babies which are supposedly immune to HIV, right? And they had no moral qualms about doing so. How do we compete long term when they seem to have fewer rules about their mode of operation? They don't seem to have sort of, for lack of a better term, the moral handcuffs that our regulatory bodies confer onto our companies. And do you think that's even real or a valid perspective?
Well, that's not new. The Soviet Union had relatively few morals. The Nazis had even less, and we beat both of those regimes. So, and look, we are much stronger than China in almost every respect, right? There is no reason, if we're smart and use our advantages to the fullest extent, why we should lose this conflict or have it deteriorate into a kinetic one. Hopefully it will stay cold, right? But we are an economy that's 25% greater than China. And it's not very clear that unless something dramatic changes in their economy to upend their stagnation path, or something dramatically changes in ours, we sort of collapse into our own, ball of, surrounded by oceans and isolated from the world, which maybe will happen. We'll see. But unless something like that changes, they'll never catch up with us, right? Because the growth rate has slowed down dramatically. So the trajectory just will never allow them to catch up. Our military is way, way stronger than theirs, except in one issue, which is the regional conflict over Taiwan, where they're starting to get closer and closer to parity. But if you think about a hypothetical conflict with China, a naval battle in the Atlantic Ocean, or land war in Africa, like it wouldn't even be close. They couldn't even sustain their logistics over there in the way that we can, right? The challenge is that we've built a military, the world's biggest military, that is designed to fight any foe anywhere in the world at any time. And that's incredibly expensive and dilutes a lot of your capabilities, where now you have an adversary that has been geared towards a very small regional conflict next to their own backyard, and that's where we're challenged. But in terms of our overall military strength, doesn't even come close. Technologically, we're far advanced in almost every area: AI, semiconductors, aerospace with reusable rockets and low Earth orbit stuff that we're doing. Even biotech, we're still far ahead, and I think we'll be even further ahead with AI. Now, in a few areas, we're starting to fall behind, and energy is one of those. Particularly renewables, batteries, and wind, solar, nuclear, etc. Critical minerals that we've already talked about. They've doubled down on refining. Semiconductors, they're trying to catch up, and they're trying to catch up actually across all these areas, but still far behind in many of them. But we can squander this lead, and the only reason they're in a strong position that they are today is because we let them. Right, for 20 years, we've let our eye off the ball. We've diluted our resources fighting conflicts in the Middle East, and at the same time, basically empowered China by letting them into the WTO, giving them access to our markets, enabling them to destroy and haul out our manufacturing base, and so forth and so forth. And as a result, they're now in the position that they are. And by the way, enabled, this is something I've spent a good chunk of my life trying to prevent, huge amounts of intellectual property theft, stealing everything that's not bolted down through cyber intrusions and other forms of espionage to enable them to catch up. So we've paid little attention to this for 20 years, and now we're waking up slowly and saying, wait a second, China may be a problem, right? Well, it's been a problem for a long time, and it's getting to be more of a problem.
Going on the espionage, these AI labs, we have, Anthropic and OpenAI and the big labs at Meta and Google and so forth. How tight do you think those labs are? And are you concerned personally about leaks of IP coming from those specific vectors?
Absolutely. I'm very concerned. Now, the IP, is somewhat important, but look, a lot of this is open source, right? And the tooling, in particular, the algorithms, the custom optimizations that people are doing are proprietary. But a lot of this is pretty well known. You're seeing this, right? ChatGPT releases deep research, the deep reasoning capability. Like within a week, I think Google releases the same feature, right? And Anthropic is not far behind. So they're all so close to each other. So you can tell that there's not like a huge proprietary lead amongst many of them. And, you've seen with DeepSeek catching up as well. Now, if the policy that I am arguing for on the chips export control is successful and China starts falling further and further behind, then ability to steal model weights from these companies, right, is going to be pretty important. And I do worry a lot about our ability to stop it, both through cyber and non-cyber means. They could recruit people inside those companies. They can, get moles to be hired there. All sorts of things can happen to help facilitate that theft.
The last guest that we had on our podcast was a guy named Matthew Pines, who is deep into the UAP disclosure movement. And I honestly don't know what to make of it. There's been enough high-level hearings, and you have this new documentary that came out, The Age of Disclosure, where it goes deep into the rabbit hole, and I haven't seen it, but if you listen to some of these people that have been testifying before Congress, talking about reverse engineering programs, all of this kind of stuff, in the spirit of hey, if this is a 1% or a 5%, or if it's actually real, this is something that could change the complete geostrategic picture. Have you ever looked into this? Do you have any probabilities that you've put on any of these things that are coming out?
No, I've paid no attention to this. I worry about the enemies that are on our planet mostly, and someone else can worry about the outer space ones.
But those are the most fun ones.
Perhaps. I do wonder why most of these sightings only happen in America. Maybe the aliens really like this country more than anywhere else.
Or maybe we're obsessed with sci-fi. Who knows? There's one last topic I want to touch on before we log off here. The Middle East. We already kind of touched on sort of how Saudi Arabia is the site of the negotiations between Russia and the U.S. and Ukraine on that conflict. Where do you see Saudi, the UAE, and even Qatar fitting into the kind of new global regime moving forward? And do you consider them? Do you view? I mean, I'm sort of choosing to view them as a single block, but of course they each have their own strategic interests. Do you view them with skepticism? Do you view them with sort of like a openness? Do you think ultimately they'll be a valuable ally? Like, how do you see them in the next 10 years?
Well, that greatly depends on what happens with Iran, because the trajectory of these states and their relationships with each other, and as well as Israel, is purely driven by the threat of Iran. And does Iran break out to a nuclear weapon? Does it get bombed by Israel and or the United States before it can get there? Like all of those things are going to matter a great deal to how that region evolves, how they think about the security and curtailing Iranian ambitions to be a dominant player in that region. I'll tell you this from an economic perspective: Saudi Arabia, UAE. I mean, the boom that's happening there is just enormous. I was recently talking to a friend who's in mining, who had done a lot of mining and sold a lot of iron ore and other things to Beijing or to China over the decades. And he told me that he really decided to double down on this in 2005 when he visited Beijing and saw more cranes there than he had ever seen in his entire life. He said he was recently in Riyadh and saw more cranes there than he had seen in Beijing back in 2005. So the boom that is happening in that country is enormous. By the way, they're now going out into the desert and not looking for oil and gas as they traditionally have, but now looking for minerals, for lithium and other things. They want to get into the critical mineral space, build refining capacity, using some of the cheap energy that they have. So there's a lot of very exciting things that are happening in the region from an economic development perspective that's quite groundbreaking. I think the Abraham Accords of the first Trump administration, completely upended the dynamics in the region by getting Israel more integrated into that region as well. We'll see what happens with Saudi. I'm not as optimistic that they will get a deal done anytime soon with Israel. I think while the Gaza war is going on, I think it's less likely. And also, one of the things that the Saudis want in the ultimate deal is security guarantees from the United States, which probably will mean a mutual defense treaty. You have to get that through the Senate. I don't think there are 67 votes in the Senate to approve a deal like that. I think the Democrats in particular will not vote for it. So that's why I'm a little pessimistic on the near-term prospects of a Israel-Saudi reconciliation. But I think it will happen eventually. It's just a question of how long it will take.
Do you think the Red Sea is ever going to normalize in the short term? I mean, Trump is hitting the Houthis pretty hard. Biden hit the Houthis pretty hard. It didn't really seem to.
I don't think Biden hit the Houthis hard at all. I think that's part of the issue is that we've been very gloves on with the Houthis for a long time. Mm-hmm. The gloves are being taken off. We'll see what happens. And particularly, I think the Iranians are getting more scared than they've ever been. And they're making comments of, well, we're not really helping the Houthis, or standalone. Like they hadn't been making comments like that in a long time when they were saying, previously, oh, these are brothers. We have solidarity for them and the other groups that they're sponsoring across the Middle East. So I think there's potential there. It might be a long campaign. There's a lot of infrastructure there. Our intelligence on the Houthis is not great because we haven't paid attention to it. Their ability to manufacture fuel for ballistic missiles and the missiles themselves is not infinite, and ultimately we can significantly degrade that. So yeah, I do think that if they stick with it, I think we can reopen the Red Sea.
Matt, you got anything else? I think that's everything I wanted to cover.
Yeah, that's everything I'm kind of interested in. Is there anything you want to close up on, Dmitry?
No, I think this was one thing. North Korea. Do you guys want to talk about North Korea?
Yeah.
Let's do it.
So I actually think that of all the things that we've talked about and that's in the news, the one thing that's no one is really paying much attention to is North Korea. And I think you're much more likely to see transformative changes there in the near term than you are in all these other areas. I don't think we'll get to a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine anytime soon, a true peace deal, not just a temporary ceasefire. I don't think the Middle East is going to get resolved anytime soon. China, is going to continue to be a problem, and Taiwan increasingly at risk. But North Korea is one of the few bright spots that I think has potential to be very transformative. And the one thing you have going here is that Donald Trump does have a very, very good relationship with Kim Jong-un. The only U.S. president has ever had a good relationship personal relationship with a North Korean leader, right? He's been the first president to actually step into North Korean territory when he crossed the DMZ in 2019. And the reason why the talks with North Korea collapsed in the first Trump administration is because the Trump administration insisted, like every president before him since the 1990s on denuclearization of North Korea. Right, this has been a long-standing goal of ours that we can get North Korea to give up nuclear weapons. Well, North Korea now has probably 100 nuclear weapons. It has land-based nuclear weapons. It has developed submarine-based nuclear weapons. It likely has aerial bombers that can drop them as well. So likely a full triad of launchers. And it's the ultimate tool of regime survival. It is never giving them up. I'm very confident of that. That was never reality. And they always kind of played along, but it was never real. And the reality is they've been a nuclear power coming up on almost 2 decades. They first tested a nuclear weapon in 2006, right? And you know what? In the intervening 19 years, the world hasn't ended, right? The threat to the United States, I would argue, has not increased dramatically in that time frame from a North Korean perspective. Yes, they can now have missiles that can range virtually all of the United States, but they haven't launched them. So we've been able to live with it for 19 years. Could we live with it for another 19 years or 20 years? I think so. And I think that the Trump administration is likely to come to a realization that if you set the nuclearization issue aside, you can actually get a deal done with the North Koreans. That would be, I think, good for the United States to normalize the relationship between the United States and North Korea, to end the Korean War, which still hasn't ended, right? There's been an armistice in 1953, to get them to do other things we really care about, and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, because they're helping the Iranians. They had helped the Syrians with a nuclear reactor. They helped the Pakistanis back in the day. We don't want more proliferation, particularly to nefarious actors. So you could get a verifiable deal done on that potentially. You can get them to stop their aggressive missile testing in the direction of Japan over Korea, that is unnerving our allies. You can get them to stop or dramatically curtail all this nefarious cyber activity that they're doing, breaking into cryptocurrency exchanges and stealing crypto, stealing money from bank accounts, doing ransomware, all the stuff that they use to finance the regime. That's what its ultimate goal is. And you can start working slowly over time towards confidence-building measures to demilitarize the border with South Korea. Right, and get actually recognition between South Korea and North Korea. And if you do all of that and they still remain a nuclear power, are you better off? I would argue yes. I think you've dramatically lowered tensions in the region. You've allowed Korea, South Korea, and Japan to focus more on China, which is what we want them to do, rather than on North Korea. You pulled North Korea slightly away. They're not never going to be fully pulled away, but slightly away from China and Russia in the process, which is going to unnerve those two countries. So I think there's incredible potential here for a transformative deal to be done that no one is sort of focused on, but I think is going to be a priority for Trump, particularly if he gets nowhere in the near term on Russia, Ukraine, and he desperately wants, I think, a Nobel Peace Prize, or at least a nomination for one. This can give him an opportunity to get one done, right? This would be very, very historic and a lot easier than to solve the Middle East or Russia, Ukraine, potentially. And now you have, with the turmoil in South Korea, potentially an election that's going to produce a more pro-peace party in South Korea that's going to be much more amenable to the deal. So you have a lot of opportunity that's emerging for a deal to be done in the next couple of years.
Do you see, so around there was a time last year when there was a lot of World War III talk about this kind of like axis of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran becoming this kind of like new alliance. Do you find that sort of analytically useful at all to think of them as an alliance, or they're just kind of like North Korea sending a few troops here, they're selling weapons there? It's not really a strategic level partnership.
I hate that term axis. They're not an axis. They have very little in common except their anti-Americanism. And there's actually even like very little support for each other. If anything, if you were going to use the term axis, it's one that revolves around Moscow, actually. And Moscow is trying to use its centrifugal forces to bring everyone together, but they're actually like rejecting it. In fact, I heard recently from a colleague of mine that's just been in China that the Russians have been pushing for a trilateral summit between North Korea, China, and Russia, and the North Koreans and Chinese are not interested because that relationship is actually very fraught, right? Similarly with Iran, right? They're happy to like have transactional relationships with Moscow, but it's not a strategic partnership in any sense, and not certainly a four-way in which it tends to be described. So there are individual deals to be done in the furtherance of goals and objectives of each country, but it's not truly an access. And even with Russia and China, China has not lifted a finger to support Russia militarily in this conflict with Ukraine, right? To the extent it's helped, it's been in the economic sphere, it's been with dual-use materials, but it hasn't even sent weapons to Russia, right? The North Koreans and the Iranians have done far more, but they've gotten paid for that. The Iranians paid in gold, right? So this is very, very transactional relationship. We need to appreciate that what unifies these regimes is their opposition to us more than anything else. If we did not exist, if we were not in the picture, so to speak, there would be very few common ground between any of them. And I think North Korea is actually that weak link in that group of four, because it actually is not, I think, or does not have to be ideologically opposed to the U.S. Now, traditionally, it always has been, and they periodically use that anti-Americanism as part of their ideology and talking about the supposed atrocities we had committed in North Korea during the Korean War, which they started, of course. But at the same time, Kim Jong-un has expressed great willingness to go hug Trump in Singapore and Hanoi and the DMZ and explore better relationships. So I think that he has potential to turn on a dime here and not become our best friend. That will never happen. But to triangulate, because he's very concerned about growing dependency on both China and Russia. And he wants to balance it out with a relationship with us. He's not going to ban on China. He's not going to ban on Russia. But the more we can pull him away from those two towards us, the better off we'll be.
We'll be sure to put up these normalization markets between North Korea and U.S.
All right, Dmitri Alperovitch, thank you so much. The book is World on the Brink. What is the best way for people to connect with you? And last question I always like to ask is, besides the normalization stuff, are there any other markets or questions that you would like to see up on Polymarket that you'd like to get odds for?
Well, we talked about Saudi Arabia, Israel normalization.
Yep. That's
I don't know
up
if you
there,
have one, but that's probably one. Can't think of any others at the moment, but yeah, the book is World on the Brink: How America Could Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. I have my own podcast called Geopolitics Decanted that people can find wherever they get their podcasts, and also on social media, D. Alperovitch on X and other social media platforms.
All right, thanks so much. We'll have to do it again.
All right, thanks for having me.
Today's episode has been financial, investment, legal, or any other type of professional advice. Anything provided is for informational purposes only and is not meant to be an endorsement of any type of activity or any particular market or product. Terms of service on polymarket.com prohibit U.S. persons and persons from certain other jurisdictions from using Polymarket to trade, although data and information is viewable globally.